Hi everyone, welcome back to another London Power BI user group. I'm Prati and James. We both organize London Power BI user group. And today we have Chris Barber. Um, so it is quite exciting to have Chris Barber as a speaker for our user group because I've known Chris through Power BI user group. He was our regular to when we were doing the face-to-face, and he was like a one sweet attendee who always involved and who always, yeah, he was like a with nice smiley face and he was like always there. And then he became my colleague, and now he works with me and James, and we have quite a few colleagues on the call as well. So it's like I feel it's like this is what we wanted in the very beginning as well. It's like, all the attendees who come to the user group, I want them to present at some point, and I think we're slowly, we are definitely going there and getting there. So thank you so much, Chris. Actually, I'm really happy for you to be doing this session. So before I hand it over to Chris, just a few things to say. As James already mentioned, we will be recording this session. So if you don't want to be part of the recording, we would appreciate if you could turn off your videos and the audio. And yes, if you have any questions, please unmute yourself at the end and ask questions. Otherwise, we would encourage you to use the chat window, and me and James would be summarizing the questions for Chris so he could answer the questions whenever it's convenient for him. And yes, we will be recording the session, and the slides and everything will be available. I think Chris already posted the PBICs and everything on the meetup. Yeah, this is again another thing I have to say. Is like I've hosted many meetups and many sessions. I myself presented at quite a few sessions, but I've never seen someone as organized as Chris. So I have to learn a lot from you. But so yeah, you will have all the content and everything available. And I would really appreciate if you guys could provide the feedback. I will be posting the feedback form in between, and I'm sure James would mention it later as well. But it is very helpful for us and also for speakers because, yeah, we value the feedback. I think that's really important for us. So before I take up any more time, I will hand it over to Chris.
Thank you, Prathi, for that lovely introduction. And it's a real pleasure to be here. As you mentioned, obviously, I've been coming to the user group for a number of years. So obviously, you do an absolute great job alongside James as well in running this. So yeah, absolute pleasure to be here. And obviously, the Women in Data series you run as well is obviously proving to be extremely popular as well. So yeah, great stuff with all of that stuff going on. Hopefully, you can all see my screen. Please give me a thumbs up if you can or something, Prathi and James. Great stuff. That's a good sign. Okay, so let's kick off with the session. So today we're talking about how we ingest data using Power BI, using APIs. And actually, this is a really useful technique, and the amount of things that you can do with APIs is quite incredible. Today, we're going to focus on the NASDAQ stock exchange, and I'm going to show you how we can ingest data from the stock exchange really sort of nice and easily, and we can make this quite flexible, but also you can take this approach and you can do a number of other different things with it as well. The type of API we're going to focus on is REST APIs, and REST APIs account for around 70% according to the programmable web of what's available out there. So you'll get quite a good coverage looking at REST APIs, but there's other types out there like SOAP APIs and stuff like that. So for today's agenda, we're going to look at what are REST APIs and sort of a quick little explanation. I'm then going to talk a little bit around why we use REST APIs and all the sort of different time-saving devices. And then we're going to dive in to look at some examples. And then most of the session is going to be spent actually building this out in Power BI itself. In fact, we're going to use the online version of Power BI, the Power BI service. And we're going to use Azure DL Gen 2, which is what sits behind dataflows in order to build out and use most of these APIs. So let's sort of push through with the agenda. So if we imagine that we have an individual who wants to gather data from the NASDAQ stock exchange, and on the other side of that, we have an individual who contains all this data and holds all this data, we've now got sort of both sides of the coin. We've got somebody who wants the data and we've got somebody who holds all of that data. Now, because this is a Power BI user group, it's not actually a person who's going to be connecting to NASDAQ. We're going to be using Power BI. And instead of a person, it's actually a database, which is containing all of this sort of various different information. And if we just take the picture slightly more complicated, we don't have sort of one person accessing this data. We've got many different people accessing this. And I've represented this by the Power BI accessing the NASDAQ. You can imagine there's lots of other APIs from different applications which are also trying to access this information. So the API acts as an interface between Power BI and the database in order to gather that data and retrieve it and bring it back. And it's usually brought back in a JSON format, although you can quite often specify how you want that data to be returned. And there's two really important concepts that we need to understand here. And one of them is authentication and the other is authorization. So authentication is the first thing that happens, and you'll all be working online and used to this now, but obviously when you log into lots of things, you now have to authenticate yourself with your mobile app, either using Microsoft Authenticator or it'll send you a text. And all that's doing is just verifying who you are, and you are who you say you are. And an API needs to do very much the same thing. And once you've been authenticated, you then get authorized to perform certain actions. So today, we're just going to be talking about using Power BI to read data, but you can use APIs to do actually a whole host of other things. So you can use APIs to also create data, delete, modify, or replace data as well. But it's good to start off with reading data because obviously there's low risk. You can't cause a lot of damage when you're just reading data. But as Power BI developers, just remember that the shoe is quite often on the other foot. So you are actually the holders of information. You're the holders of data within your workspaces, within the Power BI service. And you can use the Power BI API as well to do things like create workspaces. You can use it to delete workspaces, all sorts of other things. So we're going to be looking at reading, but it's worth noting that there's a whole host of other things that you can do with the Power BI API itself. Okay, so why do we actually use APIs? There's a few different reasons. One of the main reasons is with lots of people looking at the data, if there are any errors, they get surfaced very quickly. So if there is an error, once they get surfaced, only one of these people, they can raise that and then they can get it fixed at source and then it gets corrected for absolutely everybody. So that's one of the main reasons. And the other is that the data is stored in a way which is easily transferable from one computer to another. And we tend to use JSON for this as one of the main sources. And not only is it easy to transfer, it's also quite easy to read. Now, you don't have to fully understand the code itself, but you can look at the JSON, and we're going to be looking at JSON a bit later on today. And you can read and you can see what it's actually doing. Okay, so obviously I mentioned that we're going to be looking at the NASDAQ today, but there are a number of different APIs out there, and I've just taken this from the Rapid API Top 50 APIs blog. So there's Skyscanner, for instance, which shows flight data in and out of Heathrow, for example, and you can use that. I know James uses different one, didn't you, when you did your demo in December, but yeah, the Skyscanner is one of the flight ones. There's email verification, which is quite useful. So imagine you're doing an event where you're getting loads of different email addresses and you want to validate those email addresses. You can actually pass those through an API and validate, you know, I've got 1,000 email addresses here, but only 50% of them are any good or are actual leads for me as a business. And you've also got the NASA API, which I've never used, but this contains things like pictures from the Mars rover, or you can even get information about, you know, asteroids which are near the Earth or whatever, or not near the Earth, but the nearest ones to the Earth. So there's a whole host of information that you can get. It's also worth saying that the use of APIs is growing. So here's a couple of the big acquisitions that have happened in the last couple of years. So we've got MuleSoft, which was bought for 6.5 billion by Salesforce, and Plaid, which was bought for 5.3 billion by Visa. So the area of APIs is already very large, but it's growing and it's going to get even bigger. So using them and learning the techniques is really worthwhile as Power BI developers, because more and more this is going to become a source that you're going to want to connect to. And there's a little quote here from Tyler Jewell, the MD of Dell Technologies, which I got from Forbes, about, you know, the world on course to have 1 trillion programmable endpoints. Okay, so that's the intro to the session. Now what we're going to do is we're going to move over and we're going to look at the actual REST API that we're going to be working with today, and then we're going to use that in order to ingest it into Power BI. So let's just switch over. Okay, so this is the Alpha Vantage website, which we're going to be using today to gather the data. Hopefully some of you have already seen, I know you've seen that I put in the comments for the meetup a link to this, but if you want to follow along, you can get your free API key, and that's what's going to be used in order to authenticate you are who you say you are. So I'm going to be using a demo key, but obviously if we all use the demo key, it will crash us out. So if you want to do this, make sure to claim your API key. But for now, let's dive in and have a look at the API documentation examples. And the reason I've chose Avanade is because the documentation here, I think, is really clear and really easy to understand. Okay, so here's the API documentation. The first thing to note is on the left-hand side here, we have a whole host of different things that we can connect to. So we've got the stock time series data, daily, weekly, monthly, etc. And we've also got a whole host of fundamental data about companies. So things like the income statement, balance sheets, cash flows, earnings, etc. So I'm a chartered accountant by background. So obviously this sort of stuff really interests me, and being able to get hold of this information quite easily and quickly is very useful. But there's a whole host of other things, Forex, cryptocurrencies, etc. So you can sort of have a look yourself. We're going to start off by looking at the time series monthly data and ingesting that in. And when we call this API, it's actually returned over 20 years of history. So we get an awful lot of data here, and it gives us the monthly opening, high, low, close, and the volume traded. But in order for it to do that, we need to give it certain information. So one of the first things we need to give it, and there's 4 things in total, well, 3 of them we need to give it, one of them is optional. And one of the first things we need to give it is the function that we require. So in this case, it's the time series monthly data that we're going to be looking at. The second thing we need to give it is the stock ticker symbol. So for instance, in this case, you could pass through IBM and it will return through IBM's stock information. You could type in MSFT and it will return Microsoft information. The third one is the optional one, which is about data type JSON. We're not actually going to worry about this. We're going to keep it as data type JSON because it provides us with the metadata as well as the actual data. So it's really useful. And then fourthly, we've got the API key, which we're going to need to pass through. And I've got my own API key. We're going to use the demo. It might crash out on us at some point, and I might have to switch over to my own personal one. So we'll see how we get on. Another thing I like about this is it gives you an example here. Whoops. Hopefully you're not seeing that. You're not seeing that. And when you click on this example here, it will give you an output of what we're going to see in JSON format. So if I click on the example, it's returning the metadata that we get. So the symbol is IBM when we refreshed it, and then it gives us all of the data. So for instance, on the 16th of February, we know that the opening for IBM was 119.9. So this is really useful. And all we're going to do is we're going to take this and we're going to copy it, and we're going to move over to our Power BI service. So here's a Power BI group that I've just set up in advance, workspace that I've set up in advance. And what we're going to do is we're going to create a new data flow and we're going to connect to this API. The reason I like to use data flows for APIs is you can reduce the amount of calls. And quite often with APIs, you get charged by the number of calls. So you can imagine if you're doing it in the Power BI desktop, every time you refresh it, you're making a call to that API. But if you create a data flow, store the output of that API, and then that's stored in Azure DL Gen 2, you can just refresh that from your Power BI as often as you want to, and you won't get charged. Okay, so we're just going to go down to new and data flow. And with a new data flow, we're going to add a new entity. And with that, we're going to go down and we're going to be choosing the web API. And all we're going to do to start with is we're just going to paste in what we got from the website, what we copied before, which is just our Avanade connection. Now, one of the things to bear in mind here is this connection has automatically put the verb get at the beginning. So we're getting the Avanade data. An API could also have delete or modify or whatever else at the beginning, but that's automatically there already, so we don't need it. But if you're using this API in other ways, you will need it. When it comes to requiring an on-premise gateway, obviously we don't need that because we're operating within the cloud. And in this case, we don't need any authentication because we're using our API key in order to authenticate ourselves. And obviously, you can imagine that's not particularly secure. for certain data sets. So you will often have an API key and you will have to authenticate yourself using something like OAuth 2 or something like that as well. Because if somebody gets hold of your API key, they could just use that in perpetuity, forever and ever. They could use your API key, and obviously you wouldn't want that happening. But in this case, there's no further authentication that we need to do. I can just pop yourself on mute if you're in the chat. That'd be great. Good stuff. So we're now just bringing in the data from the API. It's actually not going to bring through all the data. It's just going to bring a couple of rows. So we've got the metadata here, and we've got the monthly time series data. And if we drill into the metadata, we will get the same output that we saw before. So we'll see that metadata that we were looking at for IBM and when it was refreshed. Similarly, if we go into the records, we'll get a list of all of the records that we need. Now we could, with these records, we could click on each of them individually, so actually go in and have a look at them. But what we're going to do is we're going to convert this into a table of data. And once we've got it converted into a table of data, what we're going to be able to do is we're going to be able to expand out and see all of those values for all of those dates. So if we click value, let's not use the original name and click OK. We've now got for each date for IBM, we've got the opening, close, low, volume, etc., which will come through. So obviously that's quite a good start. We've already managed to connect to the API and we've already managed to bring through the data. But what we want to do is we want to make this a little bit more flexible. So the first thing we're going to do to make it a bit more flexible is rather than just being IBM, we want to be able to pass through any particular API that we want to look at. So let's do that. So in order to do that, I'm going to go over to the advanced editor. If you've not seen the advanced editor before, it can seem a little daunting the first time you get it, but I'm just going to step through what's going on here and then we'll modify it. Okay, so at the moment, I'm just spacing it out just to give myself some room to work with. Okay, so I'm just going to have a quick drink of water. Okay, so with the advanced editor, we can see what we've just been through. So at the beginning, we've got our first step, which is connecting to our source, which is Avanade. Once we did that, we've got our second step, which is navigating to our data. We then converted that data into a table. Fourth step, we expanded out all of those values from the table. So that was the monthly, open, high, low, etc. And then the in statement, all that's doing is that's returning our fourth step that we conducted. Okay, so that's expanded value is just returning the expanded value we have up here. And what we want to do is we want to modify this web.contents so that it's dynamic. So rather than just being IBM, we want it to be able to pick anything. So to do that, I'm just going to take a copy of Avanade and I'm just going to comment it out down here, just so I've got it to work with. So when it goes into green, it's commented out. I'm going to start off by connecting to alphavantage.co. And we always need this whenever we're using this API, but obviously this will be relative depending on which API you were using. So with alphavantage.co, we then want to pass through those parameters that we looked at earlier on. And the way we do that is we use something called relative path. So if I put in relative path, and then we create a new query, and that query is going to consist of those parameters that we put in. And again, I'm going to need the square brackets in order to do this. So the first thing that we're going to put through is the function, which is going to be our time series monthly. The second thing I'm going to put through is going to be the symbol equals IBM. I'm just going to keep it as IBM for now, but obviously we're going to make this dynamic in a little bit. And the third thing I'm going to put through is API key equals demo. I'm going to continue using the demo API key, but like I said, it might kick us out at some point. So this should return exactly the same results as we had before. I'm just going to put quotation marks around it. Should return exactly the same results as before, but from here we can then take this and take it further. So let's just click OK and just validate, because Power Query is very sensitive and it's case sensitive as well. So we need to just make sure that that comes through correctly. So very fortunately today it's all come through, so that looks good. Now what we're going to do is we're going to turn this so that instead of symbol being IBM, the symbol itself is going to be dynamic. The way we're going to achieve that is we're going to create a new input and a new let and in statement. So we're going to input, and let's just go let source equal, and the input is going to be our symbol, and we need to use this particular notation whenever we're creating a new function. And because we've got a new let, we need a new in, which is going to return our source from up here. And where we've got IBM, instead of IBM, we're going to replace this with our symbol that we've created. So let's try this, and we should now have a function by which we can pass through any stock ticker on the NASDAQ stock exchange and return the information that we require. Okay, it seems to have worked correctly. So I'm going to try and put in MSFT, which is Microsoft, and I'm going to invoke this just to see that it returns the values. And this should now return us all of Microsoft's stock information for the last 20 plus years. Okay, so it's just thinking about it, but hopefully it'll come through any second. Here we have Microsoft's stock information, and that's come through correctly. So that's the next step that we need to do. So we've been able to collect the API. We've also been able to make it dynamic, so we can return anything we want. The next stage, however, is we don't want to just be able to pass through one stock at a time. We want to pass through multiple stocks, and we want to look at loads of stocks at the same time. So how are we going to do that? Well, what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to go back to the advanced editor for this function that we've created. And with the advanced editor, I'm just going to take a copy of it, and I'm going to move over to our Power BI desktop. Okay, so with Power BI desktop open, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go over to our query editor using transform data. And with our query editor open, I'm going to create a new query just with the copy and paste that we used from before. So if we go new source, blank query, and that should hopefully open up a blank query. We go to the advanced editor, and let's just copy in what we created before. And that should do exactly the same thing in the desktop that we saw in the Power BI service. And indeed it has. So now with this, what we're going to do is we're going to enter in a few different stock tickers that we're interested in. So if we go enter data, and if we type in stock tickers and we do IBM and Microsoft, and let's just call that table stock tickers table, we've now got hopefully a table of two different stock tickers, and what we're going to do is we're going to take that table and we're going to apply the function in order to return the table of data for those two stocks. So the way we're going to do that is we're going to use the add column, invoke a custom function, and we're going to invoke that query one function that we created. That's going to run up. Okay, our new column can just be called invoked. And we've only got one function, which is our query one. And if we run that, we now see that for both IBM and Microsoft, we've got a table of data, which we can access just by expanding out. And there we have it. We are going to be able to see the opening, high, close, low, etc. for those two stocks. So I'm going to do the same trick as I did before, but the other way around. I'm going to copy this data from here. I'm going to move back to our data flow. Okay, so with our data flow, I noticed I've got a query noticed slightly differently. Let's just call it query one. So with our data flow selected, I'm now just going to go get data, and I'm going to copy that data across that we just did. And with a blank query, let's just copy that in. And we should get exactly the same result as we saw on the Power BI desktop. Let's see. Hopefully it's just coming through. Okay, and there we go. It's returned the same information that we saw within the desktop. The reason I've done it this way round is if you look at the Power BI service, the add column doesn't have invoke custom function yet. So I could have written it all within the code itself, but I find it easier just to do it within the desktop and then copy it across. So with this information, I'm just going to rename it. So I'll take an example. I'm just going to tidy this data up a little bit and do a little bit of visualization. And then what we'll do is we'll take it to the next level. So to tidy it up, the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to use the formula bar just to rename some of these. So where it says name, that's not very useful. I'm going to call that date. Where it says one.open, we don't need the one dot. And you'll notice that the headers will change when I hit enter. So we've got 3.low, 4.close, and 5.volume. So if I hit enter now, hopefully all those headers should now change. And the reason I prefer to do it this way rather than rename them is it doesn't add an extra step to your query editor. Okay, so we've got stock tickers and date. I'm just going to hold down shift and select both of those, and I'm going to unpivot the other columns so that we end up with all of those measures on the rows. So if we just go unpivot other columns, and we should have our stock tickers, our date, and our attribute, which is going to be a list of our measures. So again, it always uses attributes. I'm going to call this measures. And then just a little bit of changing around. As you know, we need to always make sure that our data types are correct. So I just changed the data type from date to date and the value to a decimal number. Okay, so that's obviously the first stage. We're just going to do a little bit of visualization now in Power BI just to show what the output of this looks. To do that, I need to save and close. I've actually prepared one earlier and we're going to connect to that because it does take a few seconds when you first create a new data flow for it to come through. And I don't want us to be waiting for it to spin. So I've created one in advance, but I'll just call this demo 2. Okay, so let's go back to our Power BI desktop. And I'm just going to delete those 2 queries that we created earlier just while we were playing around. And I'm going to go new source, more, and then we're going to use the Azure Data Lake Gen 2 storage within dataflows. So that should just load up. Hopefully, I'll steal a line from James. I believe how long things take to load is based on how many people are watching, not on what you're doing. So here we go, Power Platform, Power BI data flows. And if I go connect, it's just going to establish that connection. And with that, we should now be seeing a list of the data flows that we need. And I've just got it under the Power BI training routes. There's the demo 2 we just created. But I'm going to do the one that I pre-prepared earlier. And I'm going to bring through just the stock prices for now. We'll look at the IBM earnings in a little bit. Hopefully. That will allow us to load that in, and let's just load that data in. I've chosen a relatively small amount of data, so it shouldn't take long to load. So it's now just bringing that in. Oh, let's flip back to the web. Okay. All right, so we're just loading data into Power BI desktop now. It won't notice any connections because we've only got one table of data, so we don't need to worry about that. And what I'm going to do is I've pre-created a background in advance. This is also in the notes. So if you go to the meetup page in the comments, I put the background in there as well. So you'll be able to use that background file. So to add a background, we just go across to the page. We add in a page background. We set the transparency to 0 and we add in an image. And I've already got the image here pre-done. And we just make that image fit to the page. Right, this isn't a visualization session, so I'm going to be quite quick on the visualization side of things. So I'm just adding in a line graph now. But with that line graph, I'm just going to put the date on the axis. Going to put the value in the values. Oh, come on. Okay, and I'm just going to put two filters on the page so that the users can select the stock ticker, so whether they want to look at IBM or Microsoft, and they can also select the measure, so whether they want to look at the opening, the close, etc. I put measure in twice. Let's put that in, and we'll just need to make sure that these require a single selection as well. So let's start off with IBM and close. Let's just drill down. Okay, and let's just put a header up there as well so we know which stock we're looking at. So stock ticker, and I'm just going to use the card visual just quickly for that. Okay, so let's get rid of all that. Just pop that in the top corner. So now we can see that we've got IBM's information being pulled through, and we've got their closing price, but we could also look at the high, and we could also look at the volume traded for IBM, and we can also switch over to Microsoft, and we can look at the volume, close, etc. So that's obviously quite a good start. We're now being able to bring in information from the stock market using this API. But if you remember, the API key can do much more than this. So if we go back to our web again, if we look at our, check your seeing screen, yes. If we look at our API AlphaVantage documentation, we've got lots of different things that we can pass through in order to create different data. So we could get the income statement, the balance sheet, cash flow, etc. So let's add and further improve upon our function. So back in our Power BI service, let's go to our edit entities, and let's take a copy of the existing function that we've got, and let's modify it a bit further to add in some more information. So here's our function, query one. Obviously, you wouldn't call it that in real life. You'd give it a sensible name, but for now, we're just going to keep it as query one. I'm just going to duplicate that, and let's go across to the advanced editor and just modify this. Okay, so at the moment, we've got time series monthly being entered in as a function, but let's now make this dynamic. So instead of the symbol, let's add a second one in called selected function, and let's call this selected function. And we'll also get rid of these other steps that we've got here. So let's just get rid of these, step 2, etc. And let's make sure that we return our source. Okay, so that should work, and we should now be able to put through two different inputs into our function in order to return both the symbol that we want and the function we want. So if we now do IBM and we search for, should we do balance sheet? If we do IBM's balance sheet, we invoke that, we should now return all of IBM's balance sheet information. Hopefully, just give it a second just to think through. There we go. And here we are annually, and let's have a look at the quarterly list of IBM's reports. And let's decide to convert that list into a table. And if we take that table of data, as we did before, we can just expand that out to look at the actual records. So here we are, and we've got all of, hopefully you can see, you've got all of IBM's balance sheet information. So this is really powerful. Really quickly, you can get a whole host of information that you can imagine would take a long time if people were trying to gather all this manually. So you've got IBM's total assets, their intangible assets, earnings, etc. Okay, we're actually going to do something different. We're going to look at IBM's earnings. So let's put that symbol in and return IBM's earnings. And the earnings table is a very simple table, but it enables us to have a look at what the surprises were in terms of earnings. So what the market thought IBM were going to report as earnings per share versus what they actually reported. So if we just click on the list and we convert that to a table, I'm taking it a bit quicker now because I'm hoping you followed along with the previous, but basically we're following very similar steps now just to invoke this and just to tidy this up. If we just expand this out, we should get a list of IBM's expected earnings and what actually happened. And we can use this. So here we have the reported date, their reported earnings estimated, what the surprise was and what the surprise percentage. Now, I'm not going to tidy this up and bring it all through because I'm just going to bring it all through. But obviously, those of you know you'd only bring the reported and estimated. The other two you would probably just calculate within your DAX. But we can just do a quick little bit of tidying up on this. So convert that to a date. And all of these I would convert. So all the other ones we need to convert into a decimal number. So if we just go transform, and the data type would be a decimal number. So that's how we would then tidy up our earnings and we would bring that in. One other thing to bear in mind is at the moment, and if you look at the example that I put on the meetup page, is at the moment we are just using a API demo key. Here we're using the API key demo. What I would suggest that you do is you go manage parameters, add in a new parameter and call that my API key. My API key, and then obviously the current value we're doing is demo, and then use this parameter as an input into your function. That way you can just update your API key if you ever need to, and you can update it everywhere at the same time. So if we just go advanced and we go my API key, make sure I get it right because like I mentioned, it's case sensitive. And there we go. We're now using my API key. And if I ever want to change it, I can just update that parameter in order to bring that through. Okay. Perfect. Okay, so let's just go back to our desktop and let's connect to this earnings data. I've already pre-prepared this again, so we don't need to wait for it all to refresh. So let's just pop back to the desktop. Okay, so with the desktop, let's just create a new page and let's get data from Power BI dataflows. And let's just bring in this earnings data. So if we go down to stock tickets earning example, IBM earnings, and load that information in. And we're going to do very similar to before. We're going to do a quick bit of visualization just to show you what that looks like on the page. And then what we'll do is we'll talk a little bit more about authentication and then we'll close out the session. So it's just going to bring in that data now. It's not going to take very long. And as mentioned, again, just going to add a background. Page background. Zero transparency. And this time we're going to do the IBM earnings. And again, we're just going to make sure it fits the page. Not very imaginative, I'm just going to use another line chart. And that line chart, we're just going to put on it and expand out the IBM earnings and put the date on the axis and the surprise on the values. And we're just going to need to expand down as well. Oh, I haven't picked up the surprise. Let's just try that again. Okay. And there you have it. There's IBM's surprise earnings. So where the differences was from the market. And I think with a piece of analysis like this, you'd usually do something like add in the anomalies or something so it can tell you what the outliers were. Okay, as I mentioned, I just want to talk about authentication just one final time. So like I mentioned, authentication is really important. You need to make sure when you are connected to your API, you understand how it requires you to authenticate. Sometimes when you authenticate, you will need to add in a header parameter. And to do that, when you use the connector, if you go to advanced, you can then add in a token into the header parameter. So that's another way that it will ask you to authenticate. Okay, that's everything I had to cover today. We've got about 15-20 minutes for any questions. Obviously, thank you so much, Prathy and James, for having me on, and thank you all for listening. And yeah, open up for questions.
Great stuff. Thank you, Chris. I'm just going to share my screen then quickly so you can have a look through the questions that I've captured in the chat.
Great stuff.
So first of all, we've got Francisco asking or suggesting actually that I think you could use table.buffer with the refresh in Power BI Desktop.
Yes, yes. Table.buffer is one of those functions you can use. Yes, I like to stage things in dataflows, but yes, you can use that. So
and then
go on, James.
No,
read it out.
You can read them out, or I can read them out. So Mira asks, if you create a push data set in the Power BI service, who can connect to it if the API key is known?
Push data set in the Power BI service, who can connect to it if the API key is known? Well, if you create a data set within the Power BI service, anybody who can connect to that data set can use that data set, right? So it's then controlled by the workspace and who can connect into that workspace itself. I think James, unless you want to correct me on that, but I think the workspace. If you create something in a data set or a data flow or anything within a workspace, the permissions is then managed by the Power BI service. So however you want to then share that. Yeah.
Good stuff. Thanks, Chris.
Yeah.
Next up, we've got Rishi asking, is the reason that you needed to do this in Power BI Desktop? Not entirely sure which bit he was referring to, actually, but I'm sure you can jump in and clarify if necessary. Is the reason you need to do it in Desktop because there's no invoke custom function in a data flow?
Yes. So Power Query works differently in Excel, in Power BI Desktop, and in the Power BI service within data flows, and some functionality is available in some and not in others. This is changing all the time. So I'm telling you this today. I can't promise that next week, in 2 weeks' time, it will be the same. So today, there's no invoke custom function option. By the time you're watching this on YouTube or you're re-listening back to this, it might well be there. So that's why I've done it that way around. But yes, it will probably change in the future. Today, that's how it is.
Cool. Thank you, Chris. And then Hamad asks, could an access or Excel source be imported for the query?
Yes, yeah, more than welcome. Yeah, you can connect to, I don't know how many different things you can connect to, but there's an awful lot of data sources you can connect to. And if you want to, you can create your own custom connectors as well. So if the list that Microsoft provides you with isn't big enough, you can even add more. But yeah, Excel and Access are definitely there.
Great. And then Hejam asks, can we show the invoke parameter option on the front end for users to choose, or does it need to be done in the back end in Power Query?
Yes, you can have parameters pop up as options in the desktop, and you can have it that way round instead. Trying to think of a case for that. So you're thinking you would like a list of, when your desktop pops up, you would like them to add in which stocks they want effectively. Yes, you can get Power BI to prompt for parameters, and users can do it. You need a slightly more sophisticated user. I think generally for this sort of data, I would ingest it all and then allow the users to select from there. But you could, if you were dealing with maybe more live data or real-time data, where you wanted users to get the absolute latest version.
Great. And then we've got Aswin asks, is there any simple example to show ingesting incremental data?
No, I don't have one pre-prepared, but there are examples out there, and you might well want to do that rather than ingest all of the stock markets for the last 20 years of history. You might want to just build up the history so that you don't have to full refresh every time. So I don't have a simple example, but if you search out there, I don't know, I can't remember a session where you've talked about incremental refresh, Prathy and James, on this user group at some point where there's an existing video. I can't think of one, but you'll correct me if I missed out.
There isn't one that springs to mind. That's probably unless actually I do wonder whether Casper de Younger might have done one actually at some stage when we were back in the world of in-person events. I'm pretty sure he did actually. I'll try and find the link and stick it in. It should have been recorded. We've got a few more questions coming through. I'm doing my best to keep up with them while you're answering them. So Sasha asks, if you are to maintain and build history from calling an API, would you suggest to collect the data first in a data store outside of Power BI and then use that as a data source?
Yes, I mean, that's a perfectly valid way of doing it. So you can use something else to store the data and then just connect to that within Power BI. I mean, the Power BI service I'm using is using Azure DL Gen 2. So it's effectively using that storage, but you could use something else in order to do that, depending on the volumes of data you're dealing with and everything else, and who's using it as well. So, yeah.
Great. And then Rishi, I think, clarified the earlier question. And then the next one after that is how can the data flow be refreshed?
So the data flow can be refreshed very much similar to the way a data set can be. You can either trigger it manually, or you can set up a schedule to refresh. I believe the current licensing is 8 times a day that you can refresh with. So yeah, you can set it up, and that's with Power BI Pro. Obviously, if you're storing it within a premium workspace, or you're using the new Power BI Premium per user, it's extended past the 8 times per day. Yeah.
Great. And then finally, James asks, are data flows a premium option? I ask because when I go into the Power BI service and click new in my personal workspace, I don't have a data flow as an option. I think Rishi's answered that underneath.
Yes. Yeah, James, so you just have to create a workspace that isn't a personal workspace. So just create a new workspace like I've done, a training one or something, and use that, and you'll see data flows. They're not a premium option. You can access them with Pro.
Brilliant. So I think I've captured all of the questions. Prathi, have I missed any? I've done my best to try and keep up with them.
No, you have captured all.
Great stuff.
Brilliant. In which case...
Oh, we got a new question.
Okay. I always trust Rishi to get in there at the end with a question. So Rishi asks, how do you
Rishi,
deal with
you could ask personally.
Yeah, Rishi, unmute yourself and ask. That'd be easy.
And I might ask you, Rishi, and push it back to you, so you know.
He's staying silent. He says, how do you deal with a scenario where the token or API key needs to be updated?
Yeah, and this is the challenge, right? Is because the token or has to be pushed through the header. So I think the best way to do it is to create a parameter and then push that through the header. Is the most efficient way. But I think if you've got regular token and API key, you probably want to start thinking about maybe a different way of ingesting rather than doing it straight to Power BI. It depends on how frequently the token needs to be refreshed effectively. But there are challenges with it if it wants to authenticate you every time.
Great.
Yeah,
okay, well,
a link to a video that shows that actually. That's quite a difficult one. If you're using the Power BI REST API, for example, that requires a token to be only valid for an hour or so. That requires that token to be continually refreshed. I just put a link to a video about how to do that.
Great, thank you, Rishi. Okay, so if there's no more questions, we will wrap up. So obviously, Chris, thank you ever so much for such a great session. I can see lots of feedback coming in the chat window. I would also say, if you wouldn't mind, please do use the feedback form. Hopefully you can still see my screen, that I'm sharing the link there to provide feedback. We will also post it in the chat. If you wouldn't mind sticking it in there, Prathi, that would save me trying to multitask too many things. I'm not quite prepped enough to paste it in there. If you want to recap on this session, we will be posting it up on our YouTube channel. Hopefully at the weekend is probably a realistic time frame for that. Apologies for the last couple of sessions for it taking a little while to get up there. Unfortunately, I was ill and didn't get a chance to do the editing quite as quickly as I would have liked. We've got some great sessions coming up over the next couple of months. We've got Markus Ehrenmüller, who is going to do a session on self-service AI in Power BI Desktop, smart features for smart reports. Love the title there, really looking forward to that session. And we've got Alexander Arvidsson, who's doing also a great looking session on the untruthful art, 5 ways of misrepresenting data, which It's possibly quite topical at the moment too, so really looking forward to both those sessions. We will post out on social media just once we've locked down the exact date and times for those sessions. So keep an eye on Pug London on Twitter. Oh, my connection dropped there, but hopefully you got most of that. I'm just saying that we will capture the date and time for those sessions and post it out on our social media sites over the next few months. So I think that's all I had to cover. So I'll finish there with the feedback link and the link to the YouTube channel. So later. Thanks again, Chris.
Yeah.
Really great having you on.
No, thank you so much, James. Thank you, Prathy, and everybody for listening. Really appreciate it. It's a real pleasure to join the session today.
Awesome. Thank you, Chris. And
Take
thank you
care,
all.
Yeah. Thanks, everyone, for joining. Hope to see you next time.
Yes. Bye.
Bye.